Alright, we're going to go ahead and install the rudder servo. You want to see that the gear drive is towards the front of the plane. I have the grommets and the spacers already pre-installed here, so you can see I'm going to put this towards the front. And then we're going to go ahead and pre-drill the holes for the servo screws that I'm going to mount it in with. This is all just, pretty basic stuff. We're just going to pull the servo back out after drilling the holes, and then we'll put a little thin CA in there that helps harden the balsa so you get a good bite on your servo screws. Go ahead and hit that with a little kicker here, let that speed up the drying process. I always like to make sure it's dry before I put the servo in there, because sometimes it'll glue the servo spacers to the wood. So let that completely dry, and then we're just going to go ahead and just like normal, we're going to put the servo screws in and get this locked down and move on to the next step. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and install the rudder control horn. First thing you want to do is locate the two slots in the rudder there that you can see them. You can also use a flashlight to see them a little better if you can't find them, but they're right between the yellow and the silver. And as you can see here, we're going to do the typical sand all the control horns where the gluing surface will be. This helps bond the glue to the control horn. You can see I got this sped up a little bit so I don't bore you with the details, but we're going to make sure we sand all of these surfaces. And then once they're all sanded, we're going to go ahead and get the sharp hobby knife. I usually use a brand new blade, and we're just going to cut out the, we're going to find the slots here, and we're going to cut the slots out. Now, I like to just, at this point, just cut out the two slots themselves versus trying to cut all the wood out. We'll do that, as you can see, in a step later here. And then we're going to make sure that we pre-fit these control horns. Once in a while, when they put these parts of the plane in the jig and they clamp them down together and they glue them, that glue pushes out into that slot. So you want to make sure that that slot is nice and free. You can see I'm fitting it in and sort of going in a little hard. You may have to take a very thin file and just knock out some of that glue from the manufacturing process. And usually it's not a lot. It's just got to knock it out a little bit. And then you can see, you just want to make sure that that fits right. And then what we'll do, once you get that sort of pre-fitted, I like to put it all, assemble it all like this, and then cut around the bases. That way, and we'll cut around the bases, and then we'll pull the control horn back out, and we'll peel it again with a sharp hobby knife. We'll just sort of pick that covering off of there, just like that. It just comes right up, and you got a nice wood to control horn surface to help glue that, especially on the rudder. So next we're going to measure the center of these two holes. Now this is important because, and maybe I take this overboard a little bit, but you want this control horn to be exactly center in the rudder. So I'm going to get the center of the two holes, the two outermost holes, and then you can split that in half, and then you know roughly where your center is from the center line of the rudder, which you can see I usually like to just take in right smack dab in the center of the rudder, just put a little tiny sharp pencil poke in there, and that gives me a spot to lay, just like that. It gives me a spot to lay my dial calipers. And then what I do is I set my dial calipers for half the distance of that, and then I measure out to the hole, and then I do that to the other side. Now, this just gives you a rough idea of where that control horn is going to sit. The other thing that is going to be really important is to get it, the holes centered to the center line of the, or to the hinge line of the rudder. So here you can see I just make a little jig, and this is where some people may say you go overboard, but it's always worked flawlessly for me. I make a little jig, I cut the bevel on the top of that. Everything is square, and I put the lines for drilling these holes. So it actually is like a jig for gluing. You can see I have the 44.5, which is the half mark, and then I'm gonna drill holes right on that level line in the center of the rudder. So this is essentially gonna bolt just like that, and it'll hold it during the gluing process. And you'll see that in a little bit. You'll see how I do that. So for now, I'm just gonna take the little Dremel tool, and I'm gonna drill a little pilot hole right smack dab on that. Little cross lines. Change the bit out here to accommodate the 440. Accommodate the 440 hole for the control horn to bolt them. Drill that out nice and careful because this is important. And then essentially what I'm going to do is once I start the gluing process, this jig is going to hold everything perfectly in place, and the center line of that hole is going to be exactly on the hinge line, and that's where you want it. So it's going to bolt just like this, and you'll see that that's exactly how it's going to hold it. And that makes it instead of trying to eyeball it and get it in and then put it on the plane and make sure it just makes it a little bit easier. And here you can see an example of prior to gluing of it all together. You can see I have the ends to squeeze it, so those are square to each other, so you don't get them one crooked from the other. I have the ball links in there is what I was trying to say earlier. So now we're going to start the gluing process, and that's 30-minute epoxy, Gorilla Glue, whatever you like to use for putting your rudder together or gluing in your horns. And I'm going to get glue. So this is sort of tricky. You got to put this half in because you don't put glue, you only put glue on the center. So you got to push it in a little bit, and then I put, make sure especially on the rudder here when you're using pull, which this is a pull setup or a pull setup or a push-pull setup, either one. Make sure you get the glue on there pretty liberal, because you don't want this moving or pulling out or anything during flight, because this will take a lot of stress. So you're gonna get epoxy all over it pretty good. So we're just gonna get this glue, and then once you get epoxy on it, and I push it through, and you make sure you get epoxy on the base too, because I'm gonna push it through, and then I'm gonna I sort of work it back and forth to make sure that epoxy gets in there really good. Obviously have some rubbing alcohol and Q-tips and rags already available to sort of wipe up excess epoxy so you don't get it all over your covering. And then I'm going to go on the other side and I'm going to do the same thing. And you can see, I'm just going to speed this up here because you don't want to see how to put epoxy on. But I'm going to make sure that this gets all the epoxy that it deserves, and I'm working that epoxy down in those slots. Again, you want to make sure the base is on properly. The side that you sanded goes towards the glue. And then we're going to get this locked in. Sort of, you want to make sure they're even, and this is where we're going to put the 440 bolts and our ball links in. So you can see I'm just going to put the ball link in there. And you got 30 minutes, so you got time to just take your time, and then I'm going to snug this in there with a 440 bolt or nut. And you're not making this tight. You just want this, basically this jig to hold the, control horn. Just going to give it a little snug there. And then now you can see that this jig will hold your holes directly on the hinge line. We're going to wipe up all that excess epoxy. It's going to hold your holes directly on the hinge line, and at the same time it's going to hold that control horn in spot for the drying process. I'm still going to put a couple little clamps on those bases to make sure those bases are held tight against the wood, and then we'll set it aside and let it dry for 24 hours. I'm going to go ahead and wipe everything up, make sure everything's nice and clean, because obviously details in your build will make it look better. And then I'm just going to get some little clamps, and then I like to clamp those two base plates. Once I get everything straight, I clamp those two base plates down. And here you can see that it's square to the rudder now. And then once we get these clamps on, we'll set this aside to dry for 24 hours. Now that it's dry, we're just going to put the rudder on. We're going to slide the tail wheel tiller wire through. And then we're going to slide the removable pin all the way through the hinges, and make sure there's no binding or anything that's hurting that rudder moving freely both ways. And now the other thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that hinge is exact, or that control horn moves the exact distance in both directions. And you'll see here that control horn hits the fuselage, that the rudder bottoms out on the bevel, and that just barely touches the fuselage, if at all. And then we go to the other side, and that's the exact same thing. The bevel bottoms out. That's putting your control horn on your rudder. Okay, now we're going to set up the pull cables, and you can see here the kit contents. First, we're going to start with the ball links and the pull links. We're going to thread these into two different ball links. One ball link, well, first you can see I'm just going to put a little tiny bit of oil on there. That helps cut the thread into these ball links, because sometimes turning those threads into the ball links can create heat, and it creates the plastic gets brittle. So that oil just helps. You can see I'm just going to thread these on. And I'm going to use two different ball links. I'm going to thread it into two of the ball links with the shoulder on them, which you can see are for the servo arms, which is this one right here. And then the other one is for the control horn on the other side. You can see the difference there. That one goes to the servo. This one goes to the control horn in the back of the plane. So once you got all those done, here you can see the example of how to do the pull cables. And here we're just going to go through it. So first thing you want to do is put your heat shrink on and your crimpers, and then you're going to make a loop just like this. And then you'll go through, you'll make another loop going through both of those, and then this will give you like a movable link. You'll be able to actually move this link. And then here you can see the done product, which is heat shrinked and ready to go. So now we're going to sort of go through it. You can see this is an ARS that I'm practicing on. It's the same thing in all planes. So we're going to go through this shoulder, or through this crushable link here. We're going to sort of pull that tight, and we're going to loop it back through again. And then we'll pull that tight too, and you can see you can slide that link. You can see you want to get that, give yourself enough play there, and then you're gonna sort of pull that tight, and that'll tighten down on itself. And then we're gonna use, I got the other crushable link under the heat shrink there. Okay, so now you're gonna tighten this up. You're just gonna take the smooth side of your pliers or needle nose, and then you're gonna take the wire and slide it through the other crushable link. Some people may use one, some people may use two. I like to use two, it makes me feel better. And then I'll crimp this, make sure that's flat, and then I'm going to slide the first thing you're going to do after you're done here is I like to drip a little thin CA on there, and then you can see I'll heat shrink this, and I'll hit it with some kicker, and then slide the heat shrink over. Make sure that'll basically complete the cable setup. And now you're going to do that on all the other cable links the same way. So you're going to do